but I'll leave it be because that's still not enough evidence. But if you do it a third time, then I'll say, hey, I just noticed this. And you'll say, no, that didn't happen. And I'll say, yeah, not only did it happen, but it happened here and it happened here, and I'm not making this up. So there's something going on here, like I'm not ignoring it, and we can get to the bottom of it. And then they'll come up with a bunch of objections about why that isn't necessary, and you push those aside, and they'll come up with a few more objections, and they'll push those aside, and then usually they'll get mad or burst into tears, and if you push that aside, then you get to have a conversation. Right, and then you can solve the problem. But man, you got to be a monster, because first of all, you need 6 arguments about why their objections aren't going to stop you. And then you have to not be intimidated by the anger, and you have to not be swamped by compassion about the tears. And then you can have a conversation. And people don't do that. They won't do that. And so they don't solve the problems, and so then the problems accrue. Right? And if they accrue over 15 years of a relationship, then they end up fat, ugly, and in divorce court. So, and that's not a great outcome. It's divorce court and cancer are similar in their seriousness. Not always, but sufficiently often. So when that error emerges, it's a glimmering. Now, we talked a lot about the hierarchical structure of goals, and so here's something to think about. So the thing that announces itself as error has a twofold nature. That's because it's chaos and order at the same time, or it's because it's all the archetypal structures at the same time. It's the dragon of chaos, it's the great mother, positive and negative, it's the great father, positive and negative, it's the individual, hero and adversary. All of that manifests itself in the moment of error, right? The archetypes come forward. Did you make an error because you're a bad person? Could be. Now, so one of the things to think about with regards to that is, in the Mesopotamian creation story, when Tiamat comes flooding back, it's so interesting, that story. You think about what she does. So she's the archetype of error, let's say, the error that can take you out, that can dissolve you in salt water. Tears. Well, she's irritated because Apsu was destroyed, so the structure is gone. Carelessness has destroyed the structure. Up comes Tiamat. She's not happy. What does she do? She prepares a phalanx of monsters. It's exactly what the story says. She produces a whole horde of monsters to come at you. And she puts Kingu at their head. And Kingu is the king of the monsters. And later, so he's the ultimate bad guy. He's Satan for all intents and purposes. In the Mesopotamian version, it's out of him that Marduk makes human beings. It's out of his blood that Marduk makes human beings. That's a critical issue, man. The Mesopotamians said, imagine the worst monster you can possibly imagine. The king of all the monsters. That's the blood of human beings. Wow. So what does that mean? Well, it means that one of the terrible things that lurks, let's say that you've been in a long-term relationship and it collapses. Let's say you had a tendency towards alcoholism. You weren't so great with regards to your drug use. You're not that conscientious. And you had like 4 or 5 kind of low-rent affairs. And you know it. Your marriage collapses. Bang. Well, who do you first meet when you fall into chaos? You meet King of the Monsters. And he's you. It's like, why did my marriage fall apart? What did I do wrong? Bang, 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 bang. I did all these things wrong. Why? Because that thing inhabits me. What is it? Well, that's the most horrifying question, right? Well, that's why. So down there in the archetypal space, all these things lurk. The hero and the adversary. Well, you've just met the adversary, right? Well, maybe you were a tyrant. That's certainly possible. Maybe everything around you was chaotic. So what do you encounter when things fall apart? You encounter the adversary, you encounter the tyrant, you encounter the catastrophe of nature, and you encounter the dragon of the chaos. And they're all intermingled. You have to sort that out. That's what happens to Ellis when she goes down the rabbit hole, right? She meets the Red Queen. And the Red Queen is always running around. Off with their heads, off with their heads. And she says, in my kingdom you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. Right? Down the rabbit hole you meet the archetypes. And so, okay, so back to responsibility. Well, one of the things Solzhenitsyn detailed, he said, well, how do societies go corrupt? He said, it's easy. One little sin at a time. You go to work, someone's lording it over you, you know that they're tyrannical, you don't have the wherewithal to stand up. It's like, okay, you're a slave. And so if you continue to agree to be a slave, you will continue to generate tyrants. Right? And the only thing that can stop you from doing that, I think, is the right kind of terror. It's like, be careful what you give up. Because, and that's this logos. Okay, so all right, so that's this logos. The logos is the thing that enables you to mediate between order and chaos. And maybe you have to have some faith in that. It's like, well, what should you do if someone is harassing you? Well, you should fight back. Okay, what is that? What's the most effective way to fight back? Well, sometimes it's physical, but that's not necessarily for the best. Maybe it's through articulation. Maybe it's through analysis, right? You want to be sharp. You want to be able to decompose a problem. You want to be able to formulate an argument and a counter response. And maybe you want to be so good at that that people don't mess with you to begin with. And then you're a perfectly articulate counter monster and you never have to take your sword out. That's the place that you want to be. It's like people should know after 3 seconds of interacting with you that harassing you will be a seriously bad idea. And then you'll have a perfectly fine time with them. So, and that's part of, so there's some utility in meeting the devil in the underworld, right? Because maybe he's got something to teach you. That's certainly possible. And one of the things that you can be taught is that your normative morality, which is basically your harmlessness and your naivety masquerading as virtue, is completely insufficient to protect you in the world, especially against the sorts of things that you're talking about, which are tyranny. Tyrants will push until you push back. It's in their nature. They don't have internal controls. So they just push and push and push and push and push and push. Even kids do that. Like little kids do that all the time. They'll just push you until they hit a wall. They're actually quite happy when they hit a wall because the last thing a child wants is a universe without walls. It terrifies them, right? They want to see, well, I'm in a swimming pool. There's an edge. They don't want to see, oh, this isn't a swimming pool. This is an ocean. I'm in the middle of an ocean. I'm going to drown. That's a terrible thing for children. And that's why they need discipline and structure, because it's consistency and predictability and routine and all the things that are extraordinarily helpful to them. Okay, so now think about that hierarchy that we talked about. So you're not in a story, you're in nested stories, and the nested stories ground themselves in action, in actual embodied action. So if you're going to be a good partner, maybe you help prepare the meals, and to help prepare the meals means you pick up a plate with your hand and you move it physically through space and you put it on the table. That's where it stops being an abstraction. So at the bottom of an ethical hierarchy of value are actions. Not things, that's the scientific world, but actions. And then you can label the actions with abstractions as you move up the hierarchy. So you're good at setting the table, so that means you're good at making dinner, so that means that you've got one element of being a good partner in place, and being a good partner is one element of being a good person. And so you're not so good at setting the table and you say, well, I'm not a good person. It's like, well, no, you should go down to the higher resolution levels of the hierarchy and start there. And that's what you do when you're arguing with people. But there's another thing that's really useful about conceptualizing the hierarchy in this manner. So I think what we'll do is we'll stop now for 10 minutes, and because I want to bring up this diagram. Because what I want to do next is, it's a bleak story at the moment, because the story is something like, you're going to lay out oversimplifications in the world, and they're going to be prone to catastrophic error, and then you have to encounter what's terrifying in order to progress. And so what that means is that progression is always dependent on terror, something like that. And there's some truth in that, and that's why people don't progress. But it's not a sufficient truth, and I want to unpack that when we come back. So let's come back in 10 minutes, and then I can unpack that. There's this parable in the New Testament that just came to mind. I'm going to mangle it a bit because it's not one that I have well memorized, but and I'm probably going to conflate 2 or 3 stories together, but I think I've got it right. Christ is walking down the road, and someone picks him up, and the person is rich and like wealthy, and he has a talk. They have a talk, and the wealthy man basically tells him all the things that are wrong with his life, and then he asks him what he should do about it, and Christ says to him, you have to give up everything you own and follow me. And that's often been read as a criticism of wealth, and that's actually not what the story means. What the story means is this guy has a lot of wealth, but he's still miserable. And so that means that what he has is the obstacle to what he could be. And so that's the message of the story, is that if you're miserable with what you have, then you have to let go of what you have so that maybe you could have something else. And then there's some commentary on that story. I think other people are listening, and they say, well, if that's the price to be paid, then no one is ever going to pay it. And I think that's where the statement, it is easier for a man to go through the eye of a needle, for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter paradise. I believe that's the derivation of that story. And like I said, that's been read as a critique of wealth, but it isn't. It's a critique of attachment. Now, you know, in the Buddhist doctrine, one of the impediments to enlightenment is attachment. And people read that as saying, well, you shouldn't care for anything in the world. And there's a nihilism that's associated with that. And there is a strong nihilistic tendency in Buddhism that has to do with abandonment of the world. You see that in Christianity to some degree, with people going off to lead ascetic lives, and it's part of multiple religious traditions, that idea of asceticism, and there's some utility in it if it is your attachment, say, to material things or status or whatever that's interfering with your psychological progression. Now, the idea is that you should let go of whatever it is that's interfering with your psychological progression, because no matter how valuable what it is that's interfering is, it's not as valuable as what you're giving up. Okay. However, the criticism still stands, and the criticism was, well, if the task is that difficult, then no one's going to do it. And so in the brothers Karamazov, there's a famous story called The Grand Inquisitor, and it's a story told by Ivan Karamazov to his brother Alyosha. And Ivan is a very high status, intelligent, attractive, tough-minded soldier. And Alyosha is his younger brother, and he's kind of softer and less rational, more spiritual, and also training to be a novitiate at the local monastery. And Ivan likes to tear strips off him because he's a cynic and an atheist, and in Dostoevsky's normal, brilliant manner, he makes Ivan an incredibly powerful, articulate, and admirable character. So when Dostoevsky wants to take someone on in his literary investigations, he doesn't take his enemy and turn him into some sort of weak puppet. He takes his enemy and turns him into the strongest possible enemy he can imagine, and then goes to battle against that. It's a hallmark of great literature. It's what distinguishes Dostoevsky, for example, from Ayn Rand. Because what Ayn Rand does is she's a darling of the, I would say, libertarian/right. She takes her enemies, and they're all the same. First of all, every single one of her negative characters is exactly the same as every other one, and they're all bad. You know, there's no redeeming qualities whatsoever in them. And they also, I would say, they're weak characters who make weak arguments. That's not the way to progress. The way to progress is to take your enemy seriously, and to even inflate them into something beyond their capacity to inflate themselves, and then see if you can hammer out a solution to the genuine problem that's being posed. Anyway, so Dostoevsky does that brilliantly, always, and that's what makes him so absolutely remarkable. But anyways, Ivan tells Alyosha this story. He calls it The Grand Inquisitor, and in the story, Christ comes back to earth in the Spanish Inquisition, and he's out by a fountain, and people sort of notice him, and he starts performing miracles, and a big crowd gathers around, and it's like happy days, you know. But then the inquisitor shows up, this old, you know, harsh, tyrannical guy, and he has his guards arrest him and throws him in prison.